Good morning, everyone, and just to start by thanking Joe again for the invitation to be with you this morning. I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. It should be very interesting. There's a religious sociologist, Gladys Gagniel. She works out of Queens, and she published a book in 2016, and the title was Transforming Post-Catholic Ireland. And she defined post-Catholic Ireland in terms of what she called a shift in consciousness, in which the Catholic Church as an institution is no longer held in high esteem by most of the population and can no longer expect to exert a monopoly influence in social and political life. So I suppose she was saying in academic language what we all know has happened. She went on to argue that the future of the faith in Ireland will depend on the development of what she called extra-institutional forms of religion and religious expression. So she's talking about religion practiced outside or in addition to the institutional Catholic Church. So I suppose she's capturing well the first part of today's topic. Will the Catholic Church in Ireland survive? The short answer to that question is, I don't know if it'll survive, and nor, I suspect, does anybody else. I suppose that answer may come as a surprise to those among you who are zealous believers, and even lapsed Catholics who remember their catechism. Didn't Christ promise that he would be with the church all days, even to the end of time? Well, yes, he did. But as Enda McDonough pointed out many years ago, this does not guarantee being with the church here in Ireland all days. Look at North Africa, look at the Middle East that Sean has spoken about already, once the cradle of Christianity and now reduced to a struggle for survival. So it does depend on us. Do we want the church to survive? I think out of that kind of reframing of the question comes a more interesting problematic. The church will almost certainly survive, albeit in much reduced numbers, if it hunkers down, raises the ramparts, circles the wagons, assuming a cult-like form of so-called orthodoxy, majoring in ritual and legal purity, and running the risk of what Archbishop Dermot Martin has called, and Sean O'Malley echoed it, an irrelevant cultural minority. The other more interesting possibility and more socially connected way that the church might survive, it seems to me, is to take up the proposal of Pope Francis about the shape of the Catholic Church in the third millennium. And I want to turn to that now. Francis, as you've heard, is quite traditional in one sense. And certainly he's traditional in the sense that his approach is very much based on faith in Jesus Christ. He's unapologetic about that. He speaks about it from experience and with eloquence. He talks about the mission coming from that faith to the world. The church is not there, as has been said, for itself. It's there for the world. But then if you look a little more deeply, the revolutionary aspects of his teaching come to the fore. Mission, he says, demands reform. Not just renewal. He uses the term reform, which is what the Reformation was about in the 16th century. And the required reform, according to him, in the third millennium is what he calls a synodal church, or the model of church that was there in the first millennium. The Second Vatican Council had already hinted at that. The church was, as Gina mentioned, the people of God, and they discussed it mainly in terms of what they called a collegial church, which Mary MacGill has written a lot about. So the bishops, and not just the Pope, are the leadership of the church. And they teach and they govern. Francis wants to go further than that and take up strains that are in Vatican II already, but bring them out to more explicit visibility. And he says collegiality among bishops has to extend to synodality. And by that he means that the voices of the baptized, men and women, have to be heard. And he quotes an ancient Roman legal maxim, I'll give you a bit of Latin just to give you the English translation. Quod omnes tangit, ab omnibus tractare debet. What touches all should be dealt with by all. And so, in so proceeding, he's drawing on another teaching of the Second Vatican Council that says that baptism gives to all the faithful a share in the priestly, in the prophetic, that means teaching, and the kingly, that means governing role of Jesus Christ. And so the outreach of that, if you like, is first of all, and he starts with himself, it's the papacy, decentralization of the papacy, a greater role to episcopal conferences, synod of bishops with teeth, a scathing critique of clericalism. If he's tough on women, let me tell you, he's much tougher on clerics. Praise of governance, what he calls from the peripheries. He talks about an inverted pyramid structure of the church. And he wants a real say to be given to lay people. He talks about a listening to, the technical term is the sense of the faithful, in both church teaching and in church governance, so that the teaching and the governance are in the hands not just of the magisterium, but of theologians and lay people as well. And the way he hopes to keep the diversity together that might come out of that model is by what he calls communal discernment. So not everything that everybody says is right, so you have to have criteria for trying to decide, and he's confident that can be done, and at the same time, diversity can be respected and a culture of dialogue, open debate and consultation can be encouraged. That's a paradigm shift in the model of church as we've experienced Catholic Church, and it won't be easily implemented or realized. Already, as you know, there's huge opposition. Not least, curiously enough, not just from those who oppose him outright. He's comfortable with that. He can handle that, if you like. But opposition from those who sit on the fence and sometimes display a kind of passive aggression under the guise of apathy. They just don't get involved, and you hear rumors of people saying this will pass and wishing that things return to normal quickly. But Francis is quite determined. From the beginning, he surrounded himself with a council of cardinals rather than operating monarchically. He built widespread consultation into the Synod of Bishops on the family, and there was significant progress made in bringing church language on sexuality into dialogue with contemporary culture, not least in opening the way for baptized, divorced, and remarried people to access communion. He set up a commission to examine the feasibility of female deacons and has appointed women to senior roles within the Vatican. He's encouraged local hierarchies to assume responsibilities for issues in their own areas before bringing them to Rome in order to assure in universal communion. So, for example, the issue of married priests and a more public role for women in ministry is being treated by a synod in the Amazonian region. And the whole issue of intercommunion between Lutherans and Catholics is going through quite a torturous process within the German hierarchy. Liberals are sometimes impatient. Why is there no immediate change on contentious issues? And curiously and ironically in this matter, I think the ultra-conservative wing of the church seems to me to have noticed what is going on more accurately. They are, quite frankly, terrified by what's coming out from Rome at the moment. Because I think they realize that Francis is releasing a dynamic in the church which over the middle to long term can lead to considerable doctrinal and governance development. Francis himself uses the principle time is greater than space to mean that real change is less a matter of immediate concrete policy options, but more in question of setting in place processes by which the peripheries, and that includes poor people but also lay people of all kinds, can feed into the centre, and more lasting change can happen with a better chance of being permanent and keeping unity. He's a strategic thinker, quite astute, playing a long game. And despite all the opposition, it may be quite hard to reverse the dynamic that he set in train. It would be most helpful in this context for the Irish bishops as a group to assert unequivocally that they support Francis's contention that, I quote, "what God wants for the third millennium is a synodal church." They need to do so by convoking, as the ACP, the ACI, we Church Ireland have called for, diocesan and national synods as regular occurrences so that structures are in place for people to have a real say. Our civil culture today is one which values participation and inclusivity, and theology and church history indicates that the church can be true to itself and adopt this kind of culture. Several bishops have already taken some steps in this direction. There was a synod in Limerick. There were listening exercises in Killaloe, down in Connor, Kilmore, Killala, and elsewhere. But a much more concerted, serious commitment needs to be made, in particular by the nominal leadership within the hierarchy, I mean the four archbishops, so that at this time of crisis, the remaining repressed energy of Irish lay people can be released and harnessed. I think this is particularly so with regard to young people, among whom there's an enormous disconnect between them and church teaching, in particular on sexuality and gender, and who find a monolithic, centralized, and clerically hierarchical church deeply unattractive and deeply uninteresting. So finally, should it matter that the church survives or not? One of the reasons I think why it matters is that the Catholic Church has a lot to contribute in terms of values which many non-believers share and which can help to build up a better Ireland, a better Europe, and a better world. A group of us gathered together about 18 months ago: Dermot McCarthy, David Begg, Iseult Honohan, Dermot Lane, Fergus O'Farrell, and Michael Cronin. And we published a little book called A Dialogue of Hope along those lines. We argued that the narrative undergirding the current neoliberal-dominated status quo was spent, that it had led to excessive inequality and harm to our planet, that the search for a new narrative required a dialogue between believers and unbelievers, poets and scientists, economists and theologians. The distinguished German political philosopher Jürgen Habermas has come to recognize the role of religion in this dialogue, with its long tradition of social wisdom and concern. And I quote what he says: "Even today, religious traditions perform the function of articulating awareness of what is lacking or absent. They keep alive sensitivity to failure and suffering. They rescue from oblivion the dimensions of our social and personal relations in which advances in social and cultural rationalization have caused utter devastation. Who is to say," he concludes, "that they do not contain encoded semantic potentialities that could provide inspiration if only their message were translated into rational discourse and their profane truth contents were set free." Similarly, Emmanuel Macron, in a France renowned for its laïcité, secularism, recently on the occasion of his visit to the Vatican, reminded people in France that while the state is neutral, society is not, and went on to say that religious voices should not be banished to the sacristy or to the privacy of home, but should be heard in the public square for the good of society and indeed the state. And Iseult Honohan, political philosopher in our little book, argues why religious expression should not be excluded from the public square. And her reasons include justice to religious citizens, the practical integration of minorities, and the important resources embedded in religious perspectives, leading to the possibility of mutual learning between different groups. J.B. Metz, the German theologian, spoke often about the subversive memory of Jesus Christ. So a Christianity, a Catholicism like this would be no civil religion blandly endorsing the status quo, but would be a radical call to all of us to include the poor and marginalized in our political settlement. The social agenda of the Sermon on the Mount, the prophetic Jesus, might be the obvious resource of value here translated as Habermas, indicates into rational discourse. However, there is, I would suggest, more, not always translatable into modern instrumental rationality. When the miracle of a new baby occurs, when we come across the depths hinted at in falling in love, when we are brought face to face with terrible losses and suffering, illness, old age, and death, when we succeed at something that we longed to do for a long time, we want to hold on to the success, but are nervous about it dissipating. When we fail and are confronted with our limits, when we are wronged and for the greater good bite our tongues, when a communal tragedy happens and we're drawn to a church to hold vigil, when we lie awake at night and wonder, what's it all about? At these and so many other times, religion can help us hold open a space of wonder and hope and mystery in the good sense. Leonard Cohen spoke about a crack in everything through which the light comes in. And I think that's what I'm talking about, instances where there can be an opening to the greater mystery that is God. Some of us find belief very difficult for intellectual reasons, and so it's good that scientists and theologians and philosophers debate. Others find, particularly in Ireland, belief very difficult because of the terrible moral failures of the church. And so it's right that Pope Francis seeks to undo the horrible suffering of survivors of child sexual abuse. And it's right that he apologizes when he makes egregious errors in so doing, as happened in Chile. But many of us don't stop believing or find difficulty in believing for either intellectual reasons or for those moral reasons. There's a much more subtle thing going on in Western society. We drift away because we belong to a culture which Charles Taylor has so well analysed, a culture that feels content in this world, doesn't feel the need for another world, doesn't feel certainly a pining for the afterlife or for the presence of God in this life. And Seamus Heaney, as so often, put that so well. He was talking about his own experience, and he says in a poem written in 2006, "There was never a scene when I had it out with myself or with another. The loss occurred off stage." So it was a kind of drifting. And then he goes on to say later in the poem, "And yet I cannot disavow words like thanksgiving or host or communion bread. They have an undying tremor and draw, like water far down." So let me conclude. Patrick MacGill, I'm told, had great feelings for those who were poor and was leaning towards socialism. He was also a critic of venal and gombeen priests, and he might well have had great sympathy with the reform agenda of Pope Francis. And as this school reflects on Europe, a Europe that began with high aspirations of peace, reconciliation, solidarity, shared prosperity, we may realize that we are present dominated by, on one side, a failed ideology of a particular brand of market capitalism, and on the other, by a re-emergence of ugly strands of populism and nationalism. Pope Francis dares to hope that a renewed and reformed Catholic Church, with a unity that allows for diversity, might be, in his words, a standard for all the nations. Can our bishops, on the eve of a papal visit, seize this moment of hope for the Catholic Church and for our world? Thanks very much indeed.